So it feels like a nice day to take a look at some charcoal portraits by John Singer Sargent. I browse Pinterest quite a bit, every once in a while, and I'm constantly finding that charcoal portraits from John Singer Sargent keep popping up. And the fun thing is that there are so many that I haven't seen. They're always like new ones to me, surprising, because I've really studied his work quite a lot. But he must have done so many, hundreds of portraits. And so I'm constantly coming across new ones. I have a little bit of redundancy here, I see. Let me take one of these out. But this is just a small sample. There are so many more online. It is a little bit difficult to find high resolution images. Most are quite small, unfortunately. These are decent, but you really can't zoom in much more than this to appreciate detail. So we kind of just have to, admire the big techniques going on more so than the finesse. But there's so much to admire, and I just want to look over these. I did find one that is quite high resolution, so that's fun. You can zoom in quite a bit to this really high resolution photo from a museum archive, and that's where you'll often find the high quality stuff, is from museums who actually share their high quality photos. So let's just zoom in and admire these. One of the first things that appeals to me, and it feels quite intentional here, is just like the grouping of the lighter values, including like the head and the face with the upper torso here. You see, like within this region, there's very little value variation, just subtleties, right? Like I'd say the most significant bit would just be the shadow of her nose, which helps to drive a bit more focus right to her face and less down here, like below her mouth. Like her chin is like so subtle, just very, very delicately hinted at there. I think one of the more common mistakes we all tend to make when we're first doing portraits is, especially around the chin, we will often have really strong lines to define a chin. But this is a beautiful example of just how little you can get away with. It's a tricky area, but it is usually quite a bit softer than we think. The transitions are usually quite a bit softer. But you do have to have this careful balance, because if you had just a sharp line here, it would feel really rigid and a very sudden transition from chin to neck. So you also have to kind of mix in some indication of the roundness of the form as you're doing here on the chin. But let's zoom out a bit. I think it's always important to look at things up close, but also to look at things far away. And it's typically when you look far away that you can really analyze the big compositional strategy that Sargent might have had. Look at how the periphery of the hair, like the contour lines of the hair, mostly kind of just fade into the dark background. And that's something I see quite a lot, I would say, perhaps of most of his portraits even. There will be some occasions when you will see him give sharper, more definitive contours to the hair, but by and large, especially for the women with these big sort of soft updos, it tends to be a very vague line. And that is usually a good thing, because it helps to reduce the focus and the contrast around the edge of the hair, and therefore helps the viewer to focus more on the face. So I'm not going to touch on every one of these to the same degree, but I'll kind of skip around a bit and just mention things as I spot things. This is a dashing chap, though. Almost a almost feels like a caricature today, but it would be interesting to see exactly what this person looked like in reality, and to know whether or not Sargent is pushing the character very much, or if this is very natural. I'm sure he pushed quite a bit in general. I mean, the key to making a appealing portrait is often to try and flatter them quite a bit. Try to portray them as they would like to appear, more so than they might actually appear. And that can be tricky, because of course you don't want to push things too much, because then it can begin to look a bit silly. But this is a really just fine posture and portrait. I think also like this huge collar is really strong, straight collar, and the way the shape of it kind of just combines all the way down here, gives us this big vertical shape that, as you see, just kind of leads into his head. That also kind of just makes him feel really upright and straight. The actual corners, the actual contour of his shoulder is somewhat hidden. It's merging. It's a lost edge. The black suit against the black background behind him. Just a little indication of it, so it's not completely disappearing. But you can tell graphically, compositionally, Sargent is really trying to emphasize this bright shape. And I think that lends a lot to the expression of this portrait. And you'll see a lot of the portrait artists, especially of this time, but even still today, it's quite common to try to sort of downplay and blend and simplify much of the sitter's outfit, especially if you have obviously a dark garment against a dark background. It kind of naturally happens, but here you can feel like he's really exaggerating that. This head almost feels like it's floating, the way her shoulders basically disappear. You can see just kind of hints of her collar, her necklace, and that's kind of just enough for our imagination to understand and kind of take over and imagine more of her there. But this is quite an extreme example how he really just carved out the shape of her head here. This one's really elegant, really gentle feel to it. Here we see Sargent making these diagonal strokes, tonal strokes. As you see, most often he would just use vertical strokes, up and down, long strokes from top to bottom. I am curious as to what stage of the process he would do that. I would assume kind of closer to the end of the process oftentimes. But you can see he probably chose to use diagonal strokes in this case because there's sort of a diagonal gesture to this whole pose. With her eyes kind of looking off to the side for one, her head is just ever so slightly kind of tilted to the right. The turn of her head and neck relative to her body kind of gives us a sense of direction in this direction. Also, some of these draping elements here on her chest kind of have the same direction as these strokes. So it's unifying it in that way. And I do think it often is a good idea for these broad tonal strokes to complement whatever your subject is doing, whatever it's expressing. And a lot of times, if you want a very direct and sort of a sense of composition that leads the viewer up to the face, then naturally kind of a vertical directionality just kind of works well, as we're seeing in most of his. But yeah, every once in a while he does go in a different direction. Here's one example where he's not using those tonal strokes, and it feels quite different than the others, doesn't it? And that's not the only difference. I mean, it's a profile shot too. It looks like he must be reclining against a seat back, which is a bit unusual. It makes it feel a bit more spontaneous, though, like he just kind of turned to a friend and started sketching him. I don't know what the case would have been, but it does feel more informal in that way. In my experience, drawing ahead from a profile is usually a lot easier, a lot faster, and that's mainly because you're not having to constantly worry so much about symmetry of the face and features. You kind of just have to draw everything once, whereas when you're drawing a face straight on, you have to draw kind of double of everything, and in the process you need to make sure you're getting the symmetry correct from one side to the other, and that slows things down quite a bit. Some of these look maybe a bit smaller than others too. Like this one kind of feels like it might have been a smaller drawing. Some of them a bit larger. I know they were all quite a bit smaller than like his oil paintings would tend to be. And one reason Sargent did so many charcoal portraits is because they were faster, required less commitment, and probably just one sitting of a few hours. This one I really enjoy. There's a contrast going on, and it seems really subtle, but I think it's very intentional between this side, the right side, and the left side here. And just look at the treatment of the contour, how he's allowing this side to have just a completely broken edge and kind of blend with the light of the paper, whereas this side is kind of dark against dark here. And that might seem like a small thing, but I do feel like it's sort of an intentional design choice to create interest, to add variety, to just make this side look different than this side. The light also seems to be coming from this direction, so there was probably a bit more light sort of reflecting off her hair on this side. And so you get a greater sense of luminosity, sort of a radiance of light sometimes, when you kind of let that value bleed out, in this case just blending with the white of the paper. Whereas if he had a really bright bit of hair here against a darker background, it's gonna create a strong high contrast edge, and that will distract us from her face. It will begin to compete with the face. Notice also here around her neck and her shoulders, the edges falling into shadow are very soft, very gentle, and how that contrasts with these sharper high contrast edges on the opposite side. And I think I'm kind of constantly pointing out the same things, like contrast, one side versus the other, soft versus sharp, but that is a large part of what composition is, and especially with a portrait like this, which you're constantly having to think about to make it an appealing portrait. Creating variety with a logic to it. That logic being, okay, where do I want the viewer to look? Where do I don't want them to not look? I want to have a strong focus in a certain area, so I want to direct my contrast of value and edges with that in mind. So Sargent, I think much of the charcoal he's using is like a really soft, like vine charcoal, and that is great for just creating these soft tones. And that charcoal also allows you to pick out with an eraser highlights, like he's doing on the hair here. Or apparently Sargent often uses bread. These days we have kneaded erasers. I don't know if he had kneaded erasers back then, but he would apparently use bread, kind of a ball of bread. You kind of knead it, like dough, I guess, in your fingers, and apparently it was quite effective at erasing, especially I would assume the very soft charcoal. Probably wasn't so effective against more like compressed charcoal, which I assume he would use a bit of that as well, compressed charcoal for the darker statements, and in the areas that he doesn't want to disturb or lift out. So this was a very straight-on portrait, which is a little bit unusual, and I think you can kind of see why. Is that whenever the sitter is like directly facing you, there's an intensity about it. Sometimes an uncomfortable directness about it, as we see here, which can make it very striking. But you can imagine that if all these portraits, if all of them are just looking directly at us, that would be kind of off-putting, I would say. But from time to time, maybe like it helps to express the person's character. Like maybe this lady, she just naturally wanted to look straight at Sargent. Maybe that's just kind of her attitude and her personality, and perhaps he captured it that way. I really enjoy these little dark accents. This shawl or this whatever drapery she's wearing here. I guess it's some sort of fur, and you have like these dark accents. I don't know if they're feathers or something in that, but those are really fun touches. Very simple. It's actually a great example of how, like, out of context, these are just marks, right? Like they have no real descriptive form or recognizable detail about them. It's only in context that they read as something. And that goes for much of Sargent's work in this sort of impressionist style, is that you shouldn't worry too much about how something looks in isolation. How any detail of your painting looks in isolation. It's all about how does it read as a whole. That's what matters. And that's why artists like Sargent would constantly step back from their work and get a distant perspective. And that's something I try to remember to do as well. Now, I think one thing I tend to see is relatively few like long unbroken lines. He has some long strokes here and there, particularly sort of more around like the garment, to indicate long edges and whatnot. But they're relatively few compared to all the marks in the portrait, right? So when we see these like really beautiful long lines like this, they feel very intentional. They feel very dramatic. They stand out. Because most of the lines that you'll see kind of going on within the rendering of the features are relatively short. Just short marks, lots of gentle hatching going on. But whenever you can kind of balance it out with these long strokes, that is very pleasing. The long strokes, as you can see, also they taper out quite a bit. And it seems like many of these portraits, most of them actually, he's letting the lower portion of the composition just kind of fade to the paper. That seems to be his go-to strategy with most of these. And so that further helps for there to be more contrast on the upper part of the composition where the face is. And that's something else I'm seeing with all of these, is that the head is more or less placed in the same general area in each of these pages. The upper half very centered for the most part. This one, it might just be a higher resolution photo, but there's a lot more subtlety visible in this one compared to a lot of the others. The tones just feel a bit more nuanced. And I think it probably is more just a reproduction. Like so many of these, like they're small. Once they're online for a while, they just gradually tend to degrade as people resave them and repost them and whatnot. So this one, it just feels nicer, a bit more natural looking. But we can see, look at all the fun, gentle modeling of form going on his face. Not many points of high contrast. In fact, most of the contrast is really around the contour in this case. There's a bit in his eyes. I would say that's intentional. We want to have a lot of focus on the eyes, even though there's really not much detail in there, at least not that we can see here. It's just very suggested, just the impression of detail in the eyes. Just a few definitive edges here to draw our focus. But, I would generally think that I would need to have more contrast, like around the nose, for instance, and around the mouth. Just that would be my tendency. But here you can see Sargent kind of avoided that and really tried to keep the values very well grouped together, especially if we zoom out and look at the whole. And I think that's usually a big part of the charm of these portraits, is that, he's trying to beautifully render the features of the face, but his bigger focus is almost always on the bigger shapes. In this case, the way the head shape groups with this collar, right? And I feel like his primary goal or sense of direction for this portrait is to just make that big shape very appealing in itself. And then to model the features within it very carefully, trying to avoid any really dramatic dark accents that would break up that unified shape. We also have to consider that the lighting would have been different for each of these. I think Sargent mostly would travel to visit the sitter, or I suppose sometimes the sitter would come to the studio, but very often he would be just drawing in a different location. And so the lighting, and also at different time of day, by the way, he would be using natural light through windows mostly. And so the lighting is going to be different based on how bright the day is, whether it be cloudy or sunny, and also just like the relationship of the subject to the window, like what angle they are relative to the window, how big the window is, how small it is, all these variables that come into play with the lighting. We often don't think about that, but that has a huge impact on what the subject is going to look like. So for instance, I feel like this portrait has a bit of a softer, more gentle light on him. I don't see like any really strong cast shadows or definitive cast shadows, whereas this portrait right above, I feel like is a much sharper light in general, more direct light. And so we see more defined cast shadow shapes with higher contrast. I really love this one, just the fun shapes of her hair, her expression. It's a very sort of animated expression to me. It feels quite lively. It doesn't feel to me like an expression that she would just be holding the entire time that he's drawing. It feels like something he probably saw a glimpse of from time to time, and he made the effort to capture that spontaneous and fleeting expression that maybe she revisits quite a bit, but it doesn't really feel like she's like resting here for a long time, with her lips being slightly parted, her eyes being relatively wide open, her eyebrows being kind of raised ever so slightly. It makes her feel more alive, more animated. I feel like he must have exaggerated her neck and made it a bit longer than it likely would have been. Of course, also the fashion of the time would tend to emphasize the length and breadth of the necks quite a bit. Just the way the garments fall, it tends to just emphasize this area. But I feel like Sargent would often push that a bit further as well. But look at these beautiful rippling curls, wavy curls of the hair. Like, he must have spent quite a bit of time, I would say, on these. I almost would say, I don't know for sure, but it feels like he might have spent more time on her hair than he did her face in this situation. And it could be also that, once he has the hair roughly blocked in and he spent a lot of time looking at it, he might not even need her to be in front of him to kind of add a bit more refinement to that. Hard to say. And it really might feel a bit more detailed than it actually is. It's just, I can tell that he put a lot of care into it and really tried to capture the character that we're seeing here. This one, it's almost hard to tell, especially for a low resolution as this, but it looks like she has glasses. There's a slight indication of like the bridge across the nose, and these little hints of the frames and reflections of it. And this is something else I've often admired in his paintings, is the way he draws glasses. Like, it's just super minimal. Just barely there. And maybe she was wearing the kind of spectacles that just kind of sit on the nose in this case. That's probably what she has, because obviously we don't see like any anything going behind the ear. But it feels like there's just a hint there, and that's really all it needs. Okay, let me jump to the high resolution shot. And it always feels nice when you can find something this high res here. And we can really zoom in and appreciate the subtleties of the mark making. And one thing you just kind of can't help but notice is like how loose it is. We get up close and none of the lines really feel like super belabored in any way, right? Individually, each stroke is quite light and just a suggestion. And so again, that further reinforces that Sargent was never one to really quibble over each individual mark. It's much more about the orchestration of the whole. And I think that is a great mindset to have. You never want to, try to make every stroke perfect. That freezes you up too much. It will also distract you from the bigger ideas that are more important. She's just beautiful, very prestigious looking, quite minimal, especially compared to the others. Like, he didn't even use his tonal strokes. It's just direct to the white of the paper in the background. But look at how he's really deliberately letting the lower portion kind of fade out, become very subtle. Obviously a bit more emphasis on her necklace. Looks like a really nice necklace with a lot going on. But even that, like, look at the deliberate contrast between this bit here, a lot more value contrast and detail, whereas here, like, he's obviously very intentionally trying to diminish the contrast and almost, having a lot of broken edges here so that it blends in more with the surrounding values of the flesh tone. So he doesn't want a lot of focus here. And so that helps to further kind of unify, right, this big shape which leads in to her face. It also helps to create a sense of light, like I was saying before, how sometimes if you kind of diminish contrast in a lit area like this, it creates sort of a sense of radiance, like a bloom, like the light is hitting and it's blooming out in that area because it's so bright. And so that helps to achieve that effect. You can see some very subtle sort of searching lines, like here, very, very faintly, where there's probably some of his initial marks where he's trying to find the side of the face. You don't see a lot of that. So either he erased it really well, or he was just probably very light. I'm sure his initial strokes, as he's trying to find the placement of things, are just very, very light. So they do erase well if needed. Her eyes are interesting here. I feel like at a glance they feel relatively balanced and symmetrical. But when you really start to look at the subtleties and the nuances, one thing I can't help but notice is that this eye on the right has just a bit more refinement. The edges are just a bit cleaner, more defined, and sharper, right? Like, look at the edge here, especially the pupil. Look at how cleaner and sharper that is compared to this eye. And it is subtle, it's very subtle. But also, like, look at the speculator reflection here. It's just a bit sharper. And I would say there's just a hint more contrast, like the values here are just slightly darker on this eye. And Sargent, like so many artists, I think they were very conscious to put a bit more emphasis on one eye than the other. You don't want to have too dramatic of an imbalance, or it could start to look wonky. But you also don't want each eye to have such equal degree of finish and focus that they begin to compete each other compositionally. You want one eye to be a bit dominant in that regard. It just feels more comfortable. It's more interesting because there's more variety. It is usually a good idea. And I think sometimes it also, well, typically it happens naturally as well based on the lighting. So the light seems to be coming from this direction. And so that makes this eye a little bit more in shadow. And typically that's going to create this effect kind of naturally. The eye that's falling more into shadow will tend to be a bit more subtle than the eye that's in the light. Lastly, let's look at how he's treating the hairline. I think most of us perhaps, have the tendency to get really quite sharp with the hairline. But look at how soft this is. It's like incredibly soft. Much softer than I would ever think to make it, actually. Especially up here. So very intentionally, you can see he probably even had some sharper lines there initially, it looks like, but then he probably came in and kind of softened it, like blended it in a little bit. So very, very intentionally making a soft line there. And if I had to guess, it's probably because her hair is kind of protruding a bit here and casting a soft shadow onto her forehead. Same here. But then notice, as we get to the sides of her cheeks, how he is making a definitive sharp edge here on both sides. And I do think you do need to have a bit of a balance. You don't want to completely lose all the edges of the hair because that would lack a sense of structure. So try to have a bit of variety. And typically, naturally, a bit of variety is what you will see. So you don't necessarily have to invent that. The more important thing is to realize that oftentimes there is going to be just much more softness of edge, many more lost edges than we tend to expect. And that really helps the hair to feel like it's really integrated into the portrait and not Lego hair that's just kind of stuck on. Looks like he's also intentionally kind of softening the contrast of the top here. Again, like largely just to create variety. Like I think, he has these sharper edges right here, so he wants to lose some of that contrast here and then regain some contrast here. Just kind of back and forth. But, if she had like a really high contrast edge up here, up top, that doesn't look good, right? It's too definitive. It drives too much attention to this edge, which is, pulling attention away from her face. And so there's this really graceful, just sense that as we get closer to her face, the details are more defined, sharper. So creating a sense of focus here. All right, well, that is just a small sample. There's so many other amazing Sargent portraits out there to study, and I will probably take a look at more in the future. But I think that was a fun look for now. So I'll leave it there. See ya.